I am Julian, 32 years old. For the better part of a decade, I poured my blood, sweat, and absolute soul into our family's multimillion-dollar real estate development firm. And exactly 3 years ago, my own father suspended me from that very company, demanding that I apologize to my utterly incompetent older brother, Sebastian. I was standing in the middle of our executive boardroom, desperately trying to save our entire company from a catastrophic breach of contract on a massive, high-stakes lakefront project. Instead of listening to reason, my father looked me dead in the eye, in front of the board, and told me I was suffocating the company with my negativity. They laughed at me. They stripped away my dignity right there in the executive suite, treating me not like the lead project director who kept their empire standing, but like a disposable mechanic who was speaking out of turn. But there was one massive, undeniable thing they didn't know. The revolutionary core technology they were relying on to build their massive wealth didn't belong to the company at all. It belonged exclusively to me. And right now, the very same men who told me to get out, who threatened to bury me in legal fees, are facing total financial ruin, practically begging me to save their hollow legacy from the ashes. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my toxic family's empire piece by piece, hit that like button if you firmly believe that true justice always catches up to the greedy. And drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from right now and what time it is for you. It means the world to know who is part of this community. Now, let's go back to the morning everything shattered. The morning the silence in the room changed my life forever. The conference room fell absolutely silent after my father delivered his verdict. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart beat in your throat. The central air conditioning hummed faintly in the background, a low drone that seemed to mock the absolute stillness of the room. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the entire Chicago skyline stretched out, gray, towering, and imposing against the early morning sky. I had spent countless hours staring out at those very buildings, analyzing their structural integrity, admiring the sheer force of human will required to raise thousands of tons of steel and glass into the clouds. But in that agonizing moment, all I could focus on was the cold, hard surface of the mahogany table sitting directly in front of me. 2 weeks without pay for undermining my brother's authority. That was the official sentence my father, Victor Sterling, had just pronounced with the gavel of his voice. My brother, Sebastian, sat directly across from me. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive tailored designer blazer that probably cost more than most of our junior architects made in 3 months of grueling work. He was smirking. It was a slow, arrogant, utterly venomous smirk that twisted the corners of his mouth upward. He sat back in his plush leather chair, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers, just waiting. He was waiting for me to break down. He was waiting for me to beg for my job, to plead for my salary to be reinstated, or perhaps to scream in red-faced frustration and prove them right about my supposed emotional instability. I didn't do either. I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. I didn't shed a single tear. I just stood there, breathing evenly, feeling a strange, absolute, and terrifying calm wash over every nerve in my body. I looked down at the blueprints scattered on the polished wood between us. They were massive, intricate, highly detailed designs detailing a $20 million eco-mansion for a Silicon Valley billionaire. They were designs I drew with my own 2 hands. I was the one who spent late nights calculating the complex load-bearing requirements, factoring in the unpredictable soil composition of the lakefront, and ensuring every single strict structural code was met to the letter. Yet, I wasn't credited for a single line on that paper. Sebastian's name was proudly stamped in bold ink on the cover sheet as the visionary behind the project. In that exact second, staring at my stolen work, something inside me finally snapped. Or perhaps more accurately, it finally healed. I realized my loyalty had officially expired. The invisible, heavy chain that had bound me to this toxic family. The desperate, pathetic hope that one day my hard work would earn their genuine respect, dissolved into thin air. I looked at my father. He sat at the head of the table, his broad shoulders squared, radiating the kind of positional authority he had wielded like a weapon over me since I was a child. I looked at Sebastian, still wearing that disgusting, triumphant smirk. And then, I simply said, "All right." The silence that followed those two words was completely terrifying. It was terrifying because, for the very first time in my entire life, they weren't looking at an obedient, desperate son. They were looking at an architect planning a massive, calculated demolition. My father's smug smile was permanently etched into his aging face, fully convinced he had just put his rebellious dog back in its place. He wanted me to sit at home in my apartment for 2 weeks and think about my insolence. He wanted me to experience the sheer anxiety of a paused salary. He wanted me to come back begging, utterly grateful for the meager paycheck he allowed me to have, ready to kiss his ring. He wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would never dare question Sebastian's reckless, idiotic decisions again. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the one thing I had been waiting years for. He gave me the perfect exit strategy. He didn't know that the very next morning, that arrogant smirk on Sebastian's face would curdle into pure, unadulterated panic when he walked in with his morning espresso to find my office completely empty. He didn't know that there would be nothing left behind but a single, legally binding resignation letter resting dead center on my glass desk. And he certainly didn't know that when Gregory, the company lawyer, would run into this very room, his face pale as a sheet, gasping, "Tell me you didn't post it." My father's victorious smile would die on the spot. But to truly understand the sheer weight of that silence in the boardroom, to understand why I was more than willing to burn my own family's bridge to the ground without a second thought, you have to understand the decades of quiet humiliation that laid the thick foundation for it. You have to understand the toxic soil in which this family tree was planted. I thought the worst of their betrayal was behind me. I was so incredibly wrong. Growing up in the Sterling household meant learning early on that love was never unconditional. Love was a highly regulated commodity, a currency traded strictly for compliance, obedience, and optical perfection. If you were the golden child, like my older brother Sebastian, the bank of parental affection was always open, operating with an unlimited line of credit. Sebastian was loud, charismatic, and completely allergic to actual hard work. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room, shake a few hands, flash $1 million smile, and somehow take credit for the building he was standing in. I remember the Thanksgiving dinners of our childhood. They felt more like corporate shareholder meetings than family gatherings. We would sit around a massive oak table, extended family gathered from across the state, passing plates of expensive catered food. My father, Victor, would stand up, clink his crystal glass, and boast loudly about Sebastian's golf handicap, his shiny new sports car, or the promotion he was supposedly about to get. He would conveniently leave out the fact that Sebastian's college fund had to be replenished 3 separate times after he failed out of various prestigious business programs because he was too busy partying. When the conversation inevitably turned to me, Victor would offer a tight, polite smile and say, "Julian is doing fine in the back office. He's a good mechanic for our little engines. Someone has to do the dirty work, right?" That was exactly how they saw me. I wasn't an innovator. I wasn't a leader. I was just the mechanic they kept locked in the basement to fix the engines they kept breaking with their sheer incompetence. My mother, Beatrice, was the master architect of this twisted, deeply sick dynamic. She had this soft, gentle voice that she used to deliver the most manipulative psychological commands imaginable. Whenever Sebastian would take credit for my science fair projects in middle school, or later, my architectural drafts at the firm, Beatrice would pull me aside into a quiet hallway. She would pat my cheek, look at me with wide, pleading eyes and say, "Julian, you know your brother needs this win. He struggles with his confidence. You're so smart you can always make another design. Don't be selfish and tear this family apart. We need to protect your father's real estate legacy. A lawsuit or a family feud would ruin us." When you hear that narrative constantly, year after year, decade after decade, you internalize it. You internalize the toxic idea that if you just work harder, if you just produce more undeniable value, if you just keep your head down and swallow your pride, eventually the ledger will balance. You believe that one day, they will look at you, see your worth, and finally give you the respect you deserve. That is the trap. It is a prison built entirely of hope. You learn a very specific survival set. You learn that speaking up gets you cut off, yelled at, and isolated, but staying quiet keeps you in the room. You learn to make yourself so incredibly essential that they literally cannot afford to discard you. I thought I was earning my place in the family business, but really, I was just increasing their profit margins while eroding my own soul. For 6 grueling years, my office at Sterling Developments had been my only real sanctuary. It was a beautiful, expansive space, with floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the sprawling Chicago skyline. It was a view I had earned, not by blood or nepotism, but by thousands of agonizing billable hours and turning structural impossibilities into concrete reality. The walls of my office held my degrees, framed in simple black wood, hanging right alongside the major architectural awards the development division had won under my direct leadership. I had photos of my dedicated team celebrating the successful completion of the Riverire project lining one of the built-in shelves. Another shelf held the intricate physical prototypes of every major design I had personally guided, from a messy napkin sketch to a soaring steel and glass reality. I had built something tangible here, not just buildings but a standard of excellence, a level of meticulous quality that Sterling Developments had never once achieved before I walked through those doors. And the absolute crown jewel of all my work was sitting right there on my desk, catching the morning light. The Sterling Signature Eco-Frame. It was a modular, highly sustainable load-bearing system that I invented from scratch. It was nothing short of brilliant. The system cut overall construction time by 40% and increased a building's thermal efficiency by half. It was a massive game-changer for luxury real estate. My father loved the Eco-Frame because it saved him millions in raw materials and labor costs. Sebastian loved it because, as the vice president of client relations, he could slap his name on the glossy brochures and sell it to wealthy clients as top-tier green tech luxury. But I loved it because I built it from nothing. I remembered the agonizing nights I spent designing the joints, the weekends I sacrificed refining the complex geometry while my friends were out living their lives, the sheer physical exhaustion of proving it worked when veteran engineers in the industry laughed and said it wouldn't hold. For years, colleagues and external contractors whispered behind my back. They would pull me aside at dusty job sites and ask why I stayed. They asked why I let Victor take all the profits and the public glory. They asked why I let Sebastian pretend he managed complex real estate projects when everyone knew he couldn't even read a basic blueprint without getting a headache. They saw my silence during meetings as weakness. They saw my endurance as a pathetic lack of self-respect. They were dead wrong. It wasn't weakness. It was the invisible chain of the survivor. But more than that, my silence over the last 6 years wasn't mere submission. It was deliberate, cold-blooded data collection. I wasn't just enduring their daily abuse and taking the salary they threw at me. I was thoroughly documenting the infrastructure of the entire company. I was learning exactly where the load-bearing walls of their business were located. I was memorizing the codes to the metaphorical safe. And most importantly, I was quietly patenting the Eco-Frame technology entirely in my own name, under a separate legal entity called Julian Sterling LLC. I did this because, deep down in my gut, I knew a day would inevitably come when my family would try to erase me completely. I knew they would try to push me out the moment I became too expensive or too vocal. I needed to be absolutely sure that when I finally walked out the door, I didn't just leave an empty chair. I needed to ensure that I took the very foundation of the company with me. The breaking point, the moment the timeline accelerated, arrived with a hurricane of pure, unadulterated arrogance. It all started 3 days before that fateful boardroom meeting, when Sebastian managed to close a massive deal with a highly influential tech mogul from Silicon Valley. The client, Mr. Harrison, wanted a futuristic eco-mansion built right on the prime lakefront property. He wanted something flashy, sustainable, and groundbreaking enough to get him featured on the cover of Architectural Digest. It was a $20 million project. The commission alone on a deal that size was staggering. It would easily cover Sebastian's lavish lifestyle, his country club memberships, his impending divorce settlement, and his designer wardrobe for an entire year. But to secure the deal, To outbid our aggressive competitors who were circling like sharks, Sebastian made a promise. A fatal, incredibly stupid promise. He looked a billionaire straight in the face and promised him the custom mansion would be completely move-in ready in 90 days. 90 days. Any freshman architecture student could tell you that was a physical impossibility. The foundational curing time for concrete in that specific climate zone was 28 days alone. The custom glazing required for the massive lakeside windows had a rigid 12-week lead time from the manufacturer in Germany. Securing the necessary zoning approvals and city permits for a structure that close to the water would take at least 2 solid months. Sebastian had sold an absolute fantasy to a billionaire who had a legal team vicious enough to destroy our entire company if we failed to deliver. The storm was brewing fast, the clouds were turning black, and I was the only person in the building staring at the radar, realizing a hurricane was about to hit. When I saw the signed contract land on my desk, my blood ran cold. The ink was barely dry, and the timeline stipulated in the addendum was nothing short of corporate suicide. I didn't panic, though. I didn't march down the hall, kick open Sebastian's door, and scream at him for being an absolute idiot. I sat down, turned on my dual monitors, and did exactly what a professional project director does. I ran a rigorous, highly detailed critical path analysis. I looked at the soil composition reports, the global supply chain logistics for the steel beams, the HOA meeting schedules, and the labor union holiday blocks. I drafted a revised, highly comprehensive Gantt chart showing a realistic, yet still incredibly aggressive timeline of 9 full months. I drafted a carefully worded email. I attached the revised schedule and sent it directly to Mr. Harrison, making sure to copy my father and Sebastian. I included a simple, highly professional note explaining that in order to ensure absolute structural integrity and strict code compliance, this was the required expedited schedule. It was completely factual. It was devoid of emotion. Most importantly, it was absolutely necessary to prevent a massive breach of contract lawsuit that would have drained our operating accounts and bankrupted our entire firm. 10 minutes later, the illusion of family peace shattered into a million pieces. My office door flew open with such force it slammed against the wall stopper, leaving a dent in the drywall. Sebastian stormed in, his face flushed a deep, ugly red. He was shaking with rage, screaming at the top of his lungs that I was deliberately trying to sabotage his career and ruin his reputation with high-net-worth clients. He didn't care about the laws of physics. He didn't care about the curing time of concrete or the brutal logistics of international supply chains. He only cared about the massive commission check that was now in jeopardy. He slammed both of his hands down on my desk, leaning over me, his designer silk tie dangling over my keyboard. "You always do this, Julian. You always try to make me look stupid. It's a house. Just build the damn house. Just pour the foundation and put up the walls." Before I could even respond to his absolute lack of industry knowledge, my father walked in right behind him. I looked at Victor, expecting the seasoned CEO of a major real estate firm to understand the severe legal liability we were facing. I expected him to look at the numbers, recognize the disaster Sebastian had orchestrated, and back me up for the sake of the business. Instead, Victor crossed his arms, his face a mask of cold fury, and sided completely with his golden child. He looked down at me as if I were a stain on his expensive rug. He told me that sales and growth rely on vision, on pushing boundaries, and that my constant, miserable negativity was suffocating the company's potential. That was the exact moment I realized the horrible truth. They would gladly let the roof cave in on a family of 4 just to protect Sebastian's fragile ego. Right in the middle of Victor's tirade about how I lacked the sterling ambition, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from my mother, Beatrice. It read, "Julian, please stop embarrassing your brother in front of the staff. Fix the math for the client. We are family. Don't ruin this for us. Your father's blood pressure is high enough. Fix the math." As if I could negotiate a compromise with gravity. As if I could bribe the structural load of a steel beam to hold more weight just because my last name was Sterling. Then came the final verdict, the moment that severed the bloodline forever. Victor stood tall, puffing out his chest, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. A pathetic tactic that worked effectively when I was 12 years old, but meant absolutely nothing now that I was a grown man of 32. He pointed a thick finger at my face and declared I was officially suspended. 2 weeks. No pay. My egregious crime? Undermining the authority of the vice president of client relations. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the blueprints scattered on my table. I looked at my brother's smug, punchable face. I looked at my father, a man who would sacrifice his own company's integrity and his son's career to coddle a fool. I realized then that there is a tipping point in every survivor's life. A singular moment when you realize the immense debt of love and loyalty you've been trying to pay off will never actually be settled, because the other side just keeps moving the decimal point. That realization doesn't break you, clarifies you. It turns your vision crystal clear, stripping away all the emotional fog. "All right," I said quietly, my voice eerily calm. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my timeline. I didn't beg for my salary. I just accepted it. Victor looked almost disappointed, his brow furrowing because I didn't grovel at his feet. He wanted a fight so he could crush me, but I gave him nothing. He turned on his heel and walked out, Sebastian trailing right behind him like a victorious prince who had just won a war he didn't even fight. I sat alone in the quiet of my office. I reached for my computer mouse to save my complex architectural files and upload them to my secure personal drive. I had years of designs, templates, and contacts I needed to secure. Suddenly, the screen flickered. The CAD software vanished in a blink. A harsh, gray box popped up right in the center of the monitor. Access denied. Your credentials have been revoked by Administrator Victor Sterling. He had locked me out of the company servers before he even made it back down the hallway to his own corner office. He thought he was asserting his absolute dominance. He thought he was cutting off my access to punish me, to remind me who held the keys to the kingdom and who paid my salary. He had absolutely no clue that he was locking himself inside a burning building. The betrayal was absolute. It was cold, calculated, and entirely final. But as I stared at that locked screen, I didn't feel despair. I didn't feel the sting of rejection. I felt the crisp, sharp clarity of a man who suddenly realizes his chains are made of wet paper. The war had officially started, and they didn't even know I had the nuclear codes in my pocket. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. I stood up from my desk, pushing the heavy chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I walked over to the heavy oak door of my office and pushed it shut. I didn't lock it. I didn't need privacy to cry, because I wasn't going to shed a single tear. Tears imply a sense of loss, a mourning for something valuable that has been unjustly taken away. And I wasn't losing anything today. I was shedding dead weight. I was cutting a cancerous tumor out of my life once and for all. I walked over to the deep supply closet in the corner, pulled out a large, heavy-duty cardboard box, and began to pack. I moved with surgical, completely emotionless precision. The framed degrees from university came down off the walls first. Then the shiny architectural awards that Victor loved to point at during investor tours to prove our firm's prestige. I wrapped them in bubble wrap, not with the warm, bittersweet nostalgia of a man leaving his beloved home, but with the cold, calculated efficiency of an archivist preserving critical evidence for a massive trial. Every item I placed in that box was a piece of my identity that I was actively reclaiming from them. A few minutes later, there was a timid knock at the door. My assistant, Clara, poked her head in. Clara was a brilliant, dedicated young woman who actually understood the immense pressure I was under every single day. Right now, she looked utterly terrified. The rumor mill in a corporate real estate firm moves significantly faster than fiber optics, and she had clearly heard the vicious shouting from down the hall. She hovered anxiously in the doorway, clutching a yellow legal pad to her chest like a shield. She asked if I was okay. She asked, her voice trembling slightly, if it was true, if I was really leaving for 2 whole weeks. I stopped packing for a second. I looked at her, offering a small, reassuring smile that I hoped masked the absolute destruction I was currently planning in my head. I told her to pack up her things and take the rest of the day off. I didn't tell her the truth. I didn't tell her I wasn't coming back in 2 weeks. I didn't tell her I wasn't coming back ever. Once she left, I turned back to my desk. I reached out and gently picked up the heavy metal prototype of the Sterling Signature Eco-Frame. As I placed it into the cardboard box, my hand paused for a fraction of a second. This piece of steel was the structural core of every single luxury home we were currently building. It was the literal backbone of my father's current wealth and the sole reason the company hadn't gone under during the last recession. I wrapped it carefully and set it at the very bottom of the box. I was taping the last box shut, the loud, harsh ripping sound of the packing tape echoing in the sterile room, when I felt a dark presence in the doorway. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was Sebastian. The overwhelming, cloying scent of his expensive designer cologne filled the room before he even spoke. He walked in casually, acting like he owned the entire building. He ran a careless hand over the expensive drafting table I had used to design 3 award-winning estates, a table he had never once sat at to do actual work. He looked down at my neatly taped boxes and smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. He leaned his shoulder against the glass wall, crossing his arms, and told me that maybe this time off would actually be good for my mental health. He had the absolute nerve to look me in the eye and say I needed to learn that being a true part of this family meant supporting the overall vision, not constantly checking the math and ruining the mood for the sales team. Then, he did something incredibly, astonishingly foolish. He reached over to my desk and picked up the massive set of blueprints for the tech mogul's $20 million eco-mansion. The ones I had painstakingly drawn. The ones he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He held them up in the air like a hard-won trophy. He proudly announced, puffing his chest out, that he was going to personally take over the project management himself. He laughed, a short, barking sound, and said it couldn't possibly be that hard to tell a bunch of dirty contractors what to do. I stopped. I stared at him. For one brief, fleeting second, the dutiful brother in me almost warned him. I almost opened my mouth to tell him that the specific soil composition on that lakefront property required a highly specialized pile-driving depth, and if he messed it up, the entire massive structure would literally slide into the freezing water. I almost told him that our primary steel suppliers for the eco-frame required a massive 40% cash deposit by this coming Friday, or we would lose our production slot, delaying the entire project by 6 months and triggering a catastrophic penalty clause. But I didn't say a single word. I just looked at him, standing there looking so incredibly arrogant while holding my complex architectural plans completely upside down, and I felt a cold, hard satisfaction wash over every inch of my body. I picked up my heavy cardboard box. It was loaded with heavy books and thick steel, but I didn't feel the weight at all. I felt only the terrifying, exhilarating, absolute lightness of a massive bridge burning to ash right behind me. I walked past him without breaking eye contact, leaving him standing alone in the quiet office. That night, sitting in the dim light of my downtown apartment, I didn't sleep. I poured a cup of black coffee, opened my personal laptop, and pulled up my employment contract. I meticulously reviewed every single page, specifically focusing on Clause 17 subsection B regarding constructive dismissal, and Clause 22 regarding intellectual property licensing. I sent a highly secure email to my outside legal counsel, Gregory's former mentor, to confirm my strategy. The trap was perfectly set. The severance math was calculated down to the penny. The next morning, I was going to walk into that boardroom and detonate the entire company. The next morning, I woke up long before my alarm clock even had a chance to go off. I didn't feel the usual heavy, suffocating knot of dread in my stomach that had accompanied every single workday for the past 6 grueling years. Instead, my mind was incredibly sharp, crystal clear, and completely focused on the task at hand. I went through my morning routine with a methodical, almost terrifying calmness. I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, brewing a strong pot of black coffee, and walked over to the large bay window. I stood there in the quiet dawn, holding the warm ceramic mug, and simply watched the sun slowly rise over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The golden morning light illuminated the very buildings I had personally helped design, the real estate empire I had spent my entire adult life propping up. I walked into my bedroom closet and completely bypassed the standard, everyday suits I usually wore to the office. I didn't want to look like the tired employee they were expecting. Instead, I reached to the very back and pulled out a bespoke charcoal gray suit. It was a suit I had bought years ago with my very first major project bonus, but I rarely ever wore it because Victor always made subtle, passive-aggressive comments if I ever looked sharper or more put together than his golden child, Sebastian. Today, I didn't care about their fragile egos. I didn't care about preserving their delicate feelings. I tied a dark silk tie, adjusted my heavy silver cufflinks, and looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I didn't look like the quiet, submissive project director they were so used to kicking around and manipulating. I looked like a man who was about to foreclose on their entire fabricated reality. I grabbed my keys and drove to the office at exactly 9 o'clock sharp. I didn't take my usual designated spot in the dark, subterranean employee parking garage. I drove right up to the front of the massive glass building and parked my car squarely in the prime visitor section. The morning air was crisp and biting, holding that specific kind of chill that warns everyone of an approaching Midwestern winter. I walked through the heavy glass, revolving doors of sterling developments carrying absolutely nothing but a thin, black leather portfolio. I didn't have my bulky laptop bag. I didn't have any rolled-up blueprints. I just had the portfolio, and inside it, the exact legal documents that were going to change my life forever. The main lobby was bustling with the usual morning rush, but as I walked toward the front desk, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The senior receptionist, a sweet older woman named Brenda who had known me since I was a teenager fetching coffee for the architects, looked up from her complicated switchboard. Her warm, welcoming smile immediately faltered, replaced by a look of deep, uncomfortable confusion. She knew I had been officially suspended. The whole office knew. The corporate grapevine in a high-stakes real estate firm is absolutely ruthless, and a public humiliation like mine had spread to every single cubicle and water cooler by lunchtime yesterday. "Julian?" Brenda asked, her voice hushed and nervous as she glanced around to see if anyone was watching us. Are you supposed to be here today? Your father sent down a memo. He said your access was revoked." "I just have a quick meeting, Brenda," I said gently, offering her a warm, reassuring smile so she wouldn't feel caught in the middle of our family drama. "It won't take long. You don't need to page them." I didn't walk towards my old office down the right corridor. I knew the security access card in my pocket was completely dead anyway. I walked straight down the long, plushly carpeted hallway toward the main executive boardroom. Through the expensive frosted glass walls, I could clearly see the blurry, moving outlines of the people sitting inside. I didn't hesitate. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and pushed the thick oak door open without knocking. The room was already in full session. Victor was sitting comfortably at the head of the massive mahogany table, sipping casually from a delicate porcelain coffee cup. He looked incredibly smug, radiating the confident energy of a man who believed he held the entire world in his hands. Sebastian was lounging in the expensive ergonomic chair right next to him, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, completely unbothered by the fact that he had nearly derailed a $20 million real estate deal just 24 hours prior. Sitting at the far end of the long table was Gregory, our senior corporate counsel. Gregory was a meticulous, weary-looking lawyer in his late 50s who always looked like he needed a vacation. He was a genuinely good man, extremely observant, and most importantly, he was the only person in this entire building besides me who actually took the time to read the fine print of our massive contracts. When the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoed loudly in the quiet space, and all three heads snapped up simultaneously. Victor set his coffee cup down on its saucer with a sharp, aggressive clink. The arrogant smugness on his face instantly hardened into a deeply etched mask of authoritative irritation. He looked me up and down, clearly thrown off by the expensive charcoal suit and the completely unbothered, calm expression on my face. "What in the world are you doing here, Julian?" Victor demanded, his booming voice echoing off the glass walls of the large room. "I made myself extremely clear yesterday afternoon. You are officially suspended. You are not allowed on these premises until your 2 weeks are completely up. And frankly, Considering your blatant insubordination, your future salary here is highly debatable." Sebastian let out a loud, obnoxious snort. He didn't even bother to put his phone down. "Did you come crawling back to apologize already? Because if you did, you need to make it quick. We have a massive strategy meeting for the new eco-mansion in 10 minutes, and some of us actually have real, important work to do." I didn't react to the bait. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the table. I didn't pull out a chair. I didn't ask for permission to speak. I stood tall, placing my black leather portfolio gently onto the polished glass surface of the table. The soft thud commanded the entire room's attention. "I am not here to apologize to anyone, Victor," I said. My voice was perfectly level. It didn't shake. It didn't waver. It held the calm certainty of a judge delivering a final sentence. "I am here to formally resign." Victor's eyes narrowed dangerously. Sebastian finally put his phone face down on the table, a confused, ugly frown wrinkling his forehead. I reached down, unzipped the leather portfolio, pulled out a single sheet of premium, watermarked legal paper, and slid it smoothly across the long table. But I didn't slide it toward Victor or Sebastian. I slid it all the way down to Gregory, the lawyer. "Effective immediately, as of 9:05 this morning, I am formally terminating my employment with Sterling Developments," I announced, keeping my eyes completely locked on Gregory's face. "Furthermore, per Clause 17, subsection B of my signed executive employment agreement, I am officially triggering the constructive dismissal provision." For a split second, the room was dead, suffocatingly silent. And then Victor threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a harsh, barking, theatrical laugh, dripping with absolute arrogance and total dismissal. He looked at me like I was a foolish toddler demanding to drive a sports car. "Constructive dismissal?" Victor sneered, shaking his head and looking at Sebastian as if sharing a joke. "Are you completely delusional, Julian? You weren't fired. You were suspended for gross insubordination. You don't just get to quit your job and claim constructive dismissal because your fragile feelings are hurt. That's not how the real corporate world works. You don't get a magical golden parachute just because you're throwing a tantrum." I ignored Victor completely. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on Gregory, who was now staring down at the formal letter I had slid over to him, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up to read the text. "Gregory," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through Victor's lingering laughter like a sharp knife, "please remind the CEO of the strict legal definition outlined in my specific employment contract. I personally drafted that exact clause 5 years ago, back when Victor was going through his extremely messy second divorce and the company's financial stability was wildly unpredictable. I did it to protect my own livelihood and my salary from exactly this kind of emotional volatility." Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look up at Victor. He kept his eyes glued to the paper. "Under the explicit terms of the contract," I continued, reciting the exact legal words I had memorized perfectly the night before, locking a senior project director out of the main company server, completely removing their access to active architectural blueprints, and publicly demoting them in front of staff without a formal performance review or written warning constitutes a material breach of contract. By revoking my digital credentials yesterday while I was still physically inside the building, Victor legally dismissed me without cause. Victor stopped laughing instantly. His face rapidly shifted from an arrogant, dismissive pale to a mottled, highly dangerous shade of red. He slammed his large, heavy hand down on the mahogany table, violently rattling the coffee cups and saucers. "You are completely out of your mind," Victor shouted, the veins popping in his thick neck. "I won't pay you a single dime, not 1 red cent. I will tie you up in civil court for the next decade. I will bury you in so many legal fees and a massive lawsuit until you are literally begging for a minimum wage job at Walmart. The standard penalty for constructive dismissal," I said smoothly, talking right over his aggressive screaming, maintaining perfect eye contact with the lawyer, "is an immediate, non-negotiable buyout of my accumulated equity stake in Sterling Developments. I had an independent auditor run the exact math based on our last official quarterly valuation. The company currently owes me exactly $950,000. And per the contract, which you personally signed and notarized, Victor, it is payable in full within 30 days. Sebastian jumped up abruptly out of his expensive chair. His face contorted in sheer, unadulterated rage. His voice went incredibly shrill, echoing obnoxiously off the glass walls. You greedy, pathetic loser. You're trying to bankrupt your own family? You're just jealous. You've always been desperately jealous because I actually closed the big deal with the tech mogul and you didn't. You're just trying to steal my hard-earned commission to fund your sad little life. I looked slowly over at my brother. For the very first time in 32 long years, I didn't feel the familiar, crushing sting of inadequacy. I didn't feel the heavy, suffocating burden of being the lesser son. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of deep pity. He was fighting so desperately for a tin crown in a crumbling, dying kingdom. You can have the deal, Sebastian, I said softly, but with enough underlying gravity to instantly silence his shouting. You can have the vice president title. You can have the massive corner office with the beautiful view of the lake. You can have all the public credit you so desperately crave. But you absolutely cannot have my equity. It belongs to me. Victor stood up now, looming aggressively over the table, trying to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me one last time, just like he always did when we were kids. Get out of my building, he snarled, pointing a shaking, angry finger directly at the door. If you want a war, Julian, you've got one. I will personally see to it that you never work in real estate or commercial architecture in this city ever again. Get out. I smiled. It wasn't a nice, friendly smile. It was a cold, completely hollow expression. It was the smile of a man who has meticulously wired the dynamite to the foundation and is simply standing back, calmly watching the fuse burn down to the final millimeter. The money is just the beginning, Victor, I said, my voice dropping to a low whisper that somehow commanded total silence in the large room. There is one more thing we need to discuss before I leave. One more crucial clause in that contract that you obviously didn't bother to read. The entire atmosphere in the boardroom shifted dramatically, almost violently. The aggressive, screaming energy that Victor and Sebastian had been throwing at me suddenly hit a massive, invisible wall. They could clearly see the absolute, unwavering certainty in my eyes, and for the first time in my entire life, a flicker of genuine, deep-seated doubt crossed my father's arrogant face. He slowly lowered his pointing finger, his chest heaving slightly under his expensive suit jacket. I turned my attention back to the far end of the table, where the company lawyer was still staring at my resignation letter. Gregory, I said calmly, my voice steady and measured, please turn to page 14 of the employment addendum I provided in that packet, the specific, detailed section regarding intellectual property and corporate licensing. Gregory, who was already sweating profusely, frantically flipped through the thick stack of legal papers securely attached to my resignation letter. The sound of the rustling paper was incredibly, deafeningly loud in the suddenly quiet room. I watched his tired eyes scan the dense, complicated legal text. I watched as his pupils visibly dilated in real time. I watched as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Gregory looked up slowly at Victor. His lower lip was literally trembling, a stark contrast to his usual stoic, professional demeanor. Victor, Gregory whispered, his voice cracking painfully. He's right. The Sterling Signature Eco-Frame, the core patent for the technology. It isn't legally held by Sterling Developments. Sebastian scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes dramatically and crossing his arms. What in the world are you talking about, Gregory? Of course it is. We sell it every single day. It's plastered in all our marketing brochures. It literally has our family name on it. Stop being ridiculous. The patent, Gregory said, completely ignoring Sebastian and staring in pure horror at Victor, is legally registered to and completely held by an independent, separate entity. Julian Sterling, LLC. Gregory wiped his sweating forehead with a trembling hand. The company doesn't own the technology. We never did. Victor's jaw physically dropped. He looked like he had been struck hard across the face. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a chaotic mix of betrayal, rage, and sheer disbelief. So what? Victor spat, spit actually flying from his lips, desperately trying to cling to his rapidly crumbling authority. You work for me. I pay your salary. I provide your benefits. Everything you design under this roof belongs to the company. It's called intellectual property, you idiot, and we own it. Not according to the explicit, legally binding terms of the addendum we executed 5 years ago, I replied, my voice cool, steady, and utterly victorious. Clause 22 states very clearly that Sterling Developments only holds a revocable license to utilize the eco-frame intellectual property, and that license is strictly and entirely contingent upon my continued, active employment as the senior project director of this firm. I leaned forward slowly, placing both of my hands flat on the cold mahogany table, bringing myself closer to Victor. I wanted him to hear every single syllable clearly, to feel the weight of his own destruction. In the event of termination without cause, or in this specific legal case, constructive dismissal, I said, pausing for deliberate effect, watching his eyes widen, the license to use that technology is automatically revoked, effective immediately, as of 9:05 this morning. I let those words hang heavily in the air. I let the absolute, crushing gravity of the situation completely suck the oxygen out of the room. Do you understand what that means, Victor? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet echoing loudly in their ears. That means you legally cannot pour the foundation for Mr. Harrison's $20 million eco-mansion today. You cannot finish the 3 massive luxury estates currently sitting half-built in Highland Park. You cannot order the custom steel from our suppliers. You cannot even distribute the glossy marketing materials that Sebastian handed out yesterday, because they feature my patented, highly protected designs. Sebastian looked frantically back and forth between me and Gregory, sheer panic finally breaking through his arrogant, unearned facade. Wait. What is he saying, Greg? What does that mean for my contract? What does that mean for my commission? I need that money for my upcoming divorce settlement. You can't do this. If you use my technology, I continued, completely ignoring my brother's pathetic whining, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes, I will immediately sue you for massive patent infringement in federal court. And with Gregory sitting right here as my witness to this conversation, I will win. I will take every single asset this company possesses. I will take your cars, your accounts, and your real estate portfolio. You are currently sitting on a massive pile of signed contracts you absolutely cannot legally fulfill, selling a premium product you no longer own. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was a total vacuum. It was the horrifying sound of a multi-million-dollar empire collapsing in real time, brick by brick. I watched the last remnants of color drain completely from Victor's aging face. The powerful, domineering CEO who had controlled my life through deep fear and financial manipulation was suddenly gone, replaced by a terrified old man facing total, irreversible financial ruin. He looked slowly over at Sebastian, his beloved golden child, desperately hoping his vice president of client relations would somehow have a miraculous, visionary solution to save them. But Sebastian was utterly useless. He was just staring at me, his mouth hanging slightly open, looking exactly like a spoiled child who had just shattered a priceless vase he couldn't possibly afford to replace. He had no vision. He had no technical knowledge. He had absolutely nothing to offer when the real work was required. I will be expecting the buyout check for $950,000 wired directly to my account within 30 days, I said, smoothly picking up my leather portfolio and zipping it closed with a sharp, final sound. I turned away from the table and began walking toward the heavy glass door. I stopped just before I grabbed the brass handle and looked back over my shoulder at the terrified company lawyer. And Gregory, I advised, my tone dripping with cold, professional courtesy. I highly recommend you start drafting the formal cease and desist letters to all our active contractors immediately. You really don't want Victor to be held personally liable for unauthorized, illegal construction on top of a massive breach of contract lawsuit. It would completely wipe out whatever is left of his retirement. I walked out of the boardroom. I didn't storm out. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the heavy oak door behind me to make a dramatic point. I closed it gently with a soft, definitive click that sounded exactly like the final tumblers of a heavy bank vault lock falling perfectly into place, sealing them inside their own disaster. 3 months later, my life looked entirely, beautifully different. The suffocating, toxic silence of that corporate boardroom had been replaced by a new, wonderful kind of silence. The silence in my brand new, fully independent architectural studio was broken only by the soft, rhythmic scratch of my drafting pencil against high-quality paper. I had signed a long-term lease on a beautiful, expansive converted loft space in the trendy West Loop of Chicago. It had gorgeous exposed brick walls, incredibly high industrial ceilings, and massive windows that flooded the entire workspace with bright, natural light. Best of all, the air inside was completely free of toxic family politics, gaslighting, and emotional manipulation. I had used a sizable portion of my equity buyout money to completely set up shop. Gregory, absolutely terrified of the severe legal repercussions I had clearly outlined during that meeting, had personally ensured the funds were wired directly to my bank account exactly 29 days after my dramatic resignation. I wasn't just surviving on my own. For the first time in my entire life, I was absolutely thriving. I was taking meetings with clients who actually respected my input, who valued my engineering background, and who paid their invoices on time. But across town, in the sterile corporate offices of Sterling Developments, the mighty empire I had left behind was actively burning to the ground. The total collapse of the company wasn't a quick, spectacular explosion. It was a slow, agonizing, profoundly humiliating grind that played out over several brutal weeks. It started exactly where I knew it would. With the immediate, legally binding cease and desist orders I had my new legal counsel enforce on all their job sites. Mr. Harrison, the powerful Silicon Valley tech mogul, was absolutely furious when he was officially informed that construction on his dream lakefront home had been abruptly halted before the first steel beam was even raised. When Victor couldn't provide a valid, acceptable legal reason for the massive delay, Harrison didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately sued Sterling Developments for a massive breach of contract. That highly publicized, aggressive lawsuit instantly triggered a catastrophic penalty clause in the company's corporate insurance policy, raising their monthly liability premiums by a staggering 200%. Then came the absolute logistical nightmare. With their backs against the wall and the bank calling daily, Sebastian desperately tried to step up. He tried to play the role of the visionary leader he had always pretended to be during our Thanksgiving dinners. In a blind panic, hoping to save his shrinking salary and his reputation, he went behind Victor's back and quietly hired a junior architect named Felix. Felix was a kid fresh out of grad school, highly ambitious but incredibly naive to the realities of complex structural engineering. Sebastian offered him a massive cash bonus to secretly tweak my eco-frame designs just enough to theoretically bypass my strict patent protections. But there is a fundamental, undeniable truth in this world. You can manipulate people, you can manipulate emotions, and you can manipulate a family narrative, but you absolutely cannot manipulate physics. Without the precise, patented geometric core of my eco-frame, the complex load-bearing calculations simply didn't work. Felix spent 3 agonizing weeks running computer simulations, pulling his hair out, only to realize the structural integrity was fatally compromised. The junior architect finally had to sit Sebastian down in a tense meeting and explain that they needed to completely abandon the eco-friendly marketing pitch and switch back to traditional, heavy steel I-beams. This sudden, drastic pivot would immediately double the raw material cost of the project and triple the overall construction timeline. When Felix delivered the bad news, Sebastian absolutely lost his mind. He screamed at the poor kid. He threw coffee mugs against the wall. He demanded that Felix just make it work, completely ignoring the laws of gravity. Sebastian genuinely believed that possessing a fancy title meant you could simply command results into existence. He didn't understand the fundamental illusion of power via the empty chair. For years, Sebastian had sat comfortably in executive meetings, nodded charmingly at wealthy clients, and confidently signed his name to incredibly complex documents he didn't understand, firmly believing that this performance was the actual work. He believed that his unearned title of vice president inherently gave him tangible power. He didn't realize that his power was entirely borrowed. It was positional authority, power granted solely by a rigid, artificial hierarchy. It is incredibly fragile because it relies entirely on the blind obedience and competence of others. What I had always possessed, what I had spent thousands of hours building, was competence authority. Power derived from intimately knowing exactly how the machine works from the inside out. When you possess true competence authority, you don't need a fancy title or a massive corner office to lead. You just need to be the only person in the room who knows exactly how to keep the roof from collapsing onto everyone's heads. When I packed my cardboard box and walked out the door, I didn't just leave a convenient vacancy in their organizational chart. I completely removed the core competence authority from the entire building. Sebastian was left sitting in the big leather executive chair, desperately holding the steering wheel of a luxury car that had absolutely no engine. He kept turning the wheel left and right, shouting aggressive commands, but the vehicle just sat there, rapidly rusting in the driveway. I heard all the juicy, devastating details through the industry grapevine. Desperate contractors, men who had known me for years and trusted my blueprints, called me directly, begging for any freelance work because Victor was aggressively bleeding cash. He was paying astronomical daily delay penalties on 3 different stalled construction sites across the city, dealing with furious HOA boards. He had fired Felix, the junior architect, in a massive fit of rage. Worse, credible rumors were swirling that Victor was quietly taking closed-door meetings with high-profile bankruptcy lawyers just to figure out how to shield his personal real estate portfolio and his retirement accounts from the impending implosion. The prestigious Sterling name, once completely synonymous with luxury and architectural innovation in Chicago, was now a massive, glaring warning label for stalled projects, unpaid invoices, and endless litigation. I looked down at the drafting table in my new, peaceful studio. I was currently working on a beautiful commission for a local community center. It was a modest project with a fraction of the budget of a standard Sterling home, but it had infinitely more soul and purpose. Suddenly, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the wooden desk. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. Victor Sterling. It was the 5th time he had called me this week. I didn't answer. I didn't even reach for the phone. I just watched the screen glow, letting it ring out into the quiet room. I wasn't avoiding my father out of lingering fear or anxiety. I was deliberately letting him sit in the agonizing, suffocating silence that he had personally created. I was letting him feel the crushing, undeniable weight of the empty chair. He finally showed up in person on a dreary Tuesday morning. It was raining, a cold, gray, miserable Chicago drizzle that heavily streaked the large glass windows of my West Loop studio, casting long shadows across the floor. I was at my desk when I saw his car pull up to the curb. It wasn't the flagship, chauffeur-driven Mercedes S-Class he used to pride himself on, the one he bought just to show off at the country club. It was a modest, slightly older, mid-sized sedan. He stepped out into the freezing rain without an umbrella and walked slowly toward the front door. His steps were slow and incredibly heavy, lacking all the aggressive bounce he used to have. He looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him screaming in that boardroom. The rigid, overbearing arrogance that used to hold his spine perfectly straight had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out, exhausted man who looked like he was wearing a suit 2 sizes too big for his rapidly shrinking frame. I pressed the intercom buzzer to unlock the front door. I didn't get up to greet him. I didn't offer to take his wet, dripping coat. I didn't offer him a cup of warm coffee or ask how his drive was. I simply sat behind my drafting desk, my hands calmly folded on top of a fresh, clean set of blueprints for the community library I was designing. Victor stood dripping in the middle of the room, looking around at the space I had built without him. He took in the exposed brick, the modern, warm lighting, the quiet, steady hum of an independent business that was fully solvent and completely at peace. Sebastian is out, Victor said. No preamble. No fake pleasantries. No, hello, son. How have you been? I fired him this morning, Victor continued, his voice raspy and devoid of emotion. He's packing his bags right now. He's moving to Arizona to stay with his mother's sister. The divorce wiped him out completely. I nodded slowly, my expression completely neutral, offering no sympathy. That seems prudent, I replied softly. The tech mogul settled out of court, Victor stated, staring at the floorboards, unable to meet my eyes. It cost the company $3 million in immediate penalties. We had to drastically liquidate assets. We sold the family lake house just to cover the immediate liquidity gap and keep the lights on. He paused, clearly waiting for me to wince. He was waiting for me to show some sign of familial grief over the loss of our childhood vacation home, the place where we spent our summers. I didn't give him an inch. I just kept looking at him, my face a mask of polite indifference. We absolutely cannot finish the Highland Park luxury estates without the eco-frame license, Victor admitted, the defeat heavy and obvious in his chest. The prime contractors are threatening to walk off the job by Friday and sue us for lost wages. The bank is calling my personal cell phone daily. We are drowning Julian. The whole thing is going under. He took a slow, hesitant step closer to my desk, leaning his trembling hands on the back of the guest chair, but he didn't dare sit down. He looked broken. I'm here to make you an official offer, Julian, Victor said, finally looking up, a desperate, final plea in his tired eyes. Come back, not as the project director, not as an employee, as the CEO. I will step down to chairman immediately. You take full, uncontested operational control of the entire firm. You get 51% of the voting stock. It's yours. The whole kingdom. Everything I built. I sat completely still. This was it. This was the exact offer I had spent my entire 20s desperately dreaming of. This was the ultimate validation I had scraped, clawed, and sacrificed my mental health for. My powerful, overbearing father was literally handing me the keys to the entire empire, publicly admitting that I was the only person capable of ruling it. He was trying to sell me my own rightful inheritance, acknowledging that I was the superior son. And the catch? I asked, my voice flat, completely devoid of any excitement or triumph. You relicense the intellectual property back to the company, Victor said eagerly, sensing an opening, his voice rising with a desperate hope. We finish the stalled projects. We use your brilliance to rebuild the reputation. It's a sterling legacy, Julian. It belongs to you. We can fix this together. I looked at him. I really, truly looked at him. And for the very first time in my life, I didn't see a terrifying titan of industry. I didn't see the invincible patriarch who controlled my destiny. I saw a beggar king, standing ankle-deep in the smoking ruins of a castle he had set on fire with his own 2 hands, desperately trying to trade a worthless crown of ashes for a fire extinguisher. No, I said simply. Victor blinked, momentarily stunned, as if I had spoken a foreign language. Excuse me? The answer is no, Victor. I don't want the job. I don't want the stock. And I certainly do not want the legacy. You're being incredibly stubborn, he snapped, a sudden, desperate flash of the old, angry Victor breaking through the pathetic facade. I'm offering you absolutely everything you ever wanted. I'm standing here admitting you were right. Sebastian couldn't handle it. I was wrong. You won, Julian. Take the win. I didn't win. I corrected him softly, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the desk. I escaped. There is a massive difference. I stood up and walked over to the large window, looking out at the bustling city street below, watching the people go about their lives, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in this room. You think you're generously offering me an empire, Victor, but you're actually offering me a toxic Superfund site. The company is completely poisoned. The brand is fatally damaged in the industry, and the internal culture is rotting from the inside out. If I came back, I wouldn't be building anything beautiful. I would be spending the next 10 years of my life miserably cleaning up your mess. I turned back to face him, crossing my arms. But that's not even the real reason I'm saying no. The real reason is that I finally understand the actual cost of that legacy. This was the absolute moment of final severance. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the harsh, undeniable truth I had been carrying heavily in my chest since the day I packed my cardboard box. There is a persistent, dangerous myth we tell ourselves about family, I said quietly. We tell ourselves that blood is a binding, sacred contract, that we owe our parents our infinite survival and loyalty because they gave us life. But that is a lie. You didn't raise me, Victor. You managed me. You treated my affection and my talent like a renewable resource you could exploit for maximum profit. You constantly demanded absolute loyalty, but you only ever offered conditional employment. I am your father, he whispered, the words sounding hollow, pathetic, and completely meaningless in the open space of my studio. And I am a distinct legal entity, I replied, my voice hard as steel. Cutting the bloodline today isn't an act of malice. It is an act of pure self-preservation. It is the only way to save my actual self from being cannibalized by your system. If I accept your offer and come back, I am forced to accept the premise that my core worth is forever tied to your approval. I accept that I am a sterling first and a human being second. I reject that premise entirely. I am not saving the sterling name. I am saving Julian. He stared at me for a very long time. The silence stretched between us, heavy and incredibly final. He realized in that exact moment that he possessed absolutely zero leverage. He couldn't fire me. He couldn't legally disown me of what I had already built. He couldn't even guilt-trip me, because I had perfectly balanced the emotional ledger and permanently closed the account. "What will you do?" he asked finally, his voice barely a whisper. "With the patents? I'll license them," I said with a faint, genuine smile. "To other architecture firms, to our competitors, to builders who actually pay their invoices on time and respect their engineers. As a matter of fact, I'm meeting with Mr. Harrison next week to discuss finishing his home myself. The Sterling Signature Eco-Frame will eventually build thousands of beautiful homes. Victor, just not yours." He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He didn't even say goodbye. He simply turned around and walked out of the studio into the freezing rain. His shoulders were severely slumped. He was a broken man walking blindly into a future he hadn't ever planned for. I watched him go through the glass. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel overly triumphant. I just felt clear. I turned back to my drafting desk. The blueprints for the community library were waiting for me. It was a project that would genuinely serve a community, built on a solid foundation that I had poured myself. I picked up my pencil. The line was perfectly straight. The structure was undeniably sound. And for the very first time in my entire life, the design was entirely undeniably mine. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Sometimes, the hardest thing you'll ever have to do is walk away from the people who share your blood. But realizing your own worth outside of their toxic expectations is the greatest victory you can ever achieve. Never let anyone treat you like an expendable resource. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.